Jonathan, for that kind introduction. You remind me, in talking about the three bastards, of a subsequent incident when I was still in the cabinet when a little-known member of Parliament, Conservative member of Parliament, David Evans, very offensively referred to his Labour opponent as an unmarried mother with 5 little bastards. And great pressure was put on him to withdraw these remarks. After one cabinet meeting, I stayed behind to talk to John Major because we were doing a joint press conference on my proposals on what was called Basic Pension Plus, in the middle of which an official came in with a piece of paper which he gave to John Major, who said, "Oh, you better see this, Peter. We've at last got David Evans to make an official apology for referring to his opponent children as bastards." And I said, "Oh, dear Prime Minister, I hadn't realised the word was pejorative." It's the only time I've ever seen John Major speechless. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about. You've asked me to talk about the Brexit negotiations and how they could be speeded up. I don't know whether any of you are practitioners of Zen Buddhism, but you may well know that the Zen master poses a riddle to his disciple. Describe the sound of one hand clapping. I can't do that, but I can describe the sound of one hand negotiating. It's the sound that emanates from almost any discussion on the BBC, in Parliament, or anywhere else in this country when discussing our negotiations with the EU 27 on leaving Brexit. It's exclusively about Britain's hand and what it should be and how it should be played. To the extent there's any reference to the EU 27's hand or the Commission's hand, that is taken as given. That is something which we must accept and to which we must succumb, and in response to which we must make concessions. But actually, this is a negotiation. There are two hands to it, and we must recognise that. Now, because of this absurd assumption, a whole range of subsidiary assumptions have entered into public discussion. The first is that we have to take 2 years at least, and may well want to prolong it either with transitional deals or prolonging the negotiations if agreement can be reached. Actually, our objective should be to speed up the process. The one argument I thought which was most powerful in the Remain campaign, and a very reasonable argument too, was that a process of leaving would create a period of uncertainty which would be damaging, as uncertainty inevitably is, for investment and economic activity in this country. Now, because that was a credible and sensible argument, the fact that it came from the other side doesn't matter. We should respond to it and try to speed up the process as much as we can, and to minimise uncertainty in the meantime. The second unspoken assumption is that everything is up for negotiation. Actually, the first thing we've had to do, and have to keep doing, is distinguish between issues arising from Brexit, which are matters for negotiation with the other side, and issues which are matter for decision by ourselves. And most things are actually about decisions for ourselves. The whole business is taking back control, as Michael said, and then you make the decisions. It's not about asking the other side what we can do once we have back control. So we've already taken the key decision that in the Great Repeal Bill, which will repeal the European Communities Bill of Act of 1972, we will also incorporate all EU laws and regulations into our own law so that people will have certainty, and subsequently we can revise what we think is appropriate to revise, repeal what we think is appropriate to repeal, keep what we think is appropriate to keep, strengthen what we think is appropriate to strengthen. But we give people certainty by them knowing that the day after Brexit they will face the same laws as the day before, where they're running their abattoirs, making pork pies, deciding the dimensions of their axles or whatever. We also will have to take decisions about migration. One of the reasons, as Michael said, for the debate is so that we can take decisions about how many people are allowed into this country and who and from where. And also the decisions about those who are already here. I had hoped we could resolve that speedily, and if we can't get the other side to agree on responding rapidly in the negotiations, then maybe we will have to take a unilateral decision to reassure people already here that they can continue here for humanitarian reasons and also so that businesses don't have to start looking around for replacements. So all those sort of issues we decide ourselves. Now that leaves two kinds of issues for negotiation. The so-called divorce settlement, which is actually what the authors of the Article 50 thought Article 50 was primarily about. Who pays the mortgage? Who keeps the house? And is there any ongoing alimony to pay? And the other aspect, our future relationship with the EU in trade and related matters. Although the authors thought it was primarily about divorce, for one reason or other, it doesn't matter why, the wording of it is extremely helpful to us. And so it's important that we read carefully Article 50 and then hold them to it. And Article 50 says that the European Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with the departing member within the framework, taking into account the future relationship between that departing member and the EU. Now, I'm not a lawyer, Michael is, and some of you are. I don't see there's any other interpretation you can put on those remarks, but that we must know, at least in outline, what the framework of the future relationship is going to be before we can negotiate on anything else. If everything else has to be negotiated within that framework, we must know in outline what it is, and we should therefore say, right, what is it going to be? And the interesting thing is that there are only two realistic outcomes as to what that framework shall be in broad outline. We've ruled out being members of the internal market of the European Union. I use the phrase internal market because that's what it is in law. I was the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry when we had to implement the single market programme, the Single European Act, which doesn't refer, there's no reference in European law to the single market. Only the internal market of member states. And when you become an external member, a former member, you can't be members of the internal market. Being a member of the internal market means being a member of the European Union. The internal market is the market of the member states. We've ruled that out by saying we won't be subject to European law in the European Court. We've ruled out being members of the European Economic Area by saying that we will not accept free movement of labour, but will take control of those decisions ourselves. And indeed, there's a very good reason, in addition to that, for not being members of the European Economic Area. If you are, you can't make agreements on trade, on service matters, which are supremely important in our exports, because you don't have any control over the laws relating to your service industries, which is what you have to decide about in negotiations on service issues, as Shankar Singham will make clear, I suspect, in his remarks. And if you want to be, as the Prime Minister has said, the beacon of free trade, negotiating free trade agreements with other countries in the world, you can't be part of the common and subject to the common external tariff. So that leaves only two realistic outcomes. Either we negotiate a free trade agreement which continues tariff-free trade with a minimum of new barriers, non-tariff barriers, or we move to trading on the basis of most favoured nation tariffs with no discrimination under World Trade Organization rules. It's one or the other. And the important thing to recognise is both are simple to negotiate. We hear a lot of nonsense, particularly from today's programme, if you're foolish enough like me to inflict that upon yourself every morning, trade agreements take an awful long time to negotiate. Actually, the average time of all trade negotiations since 1990 to negotiate is 28 months. And that is biased upwards by multinational agreements, particularly those involving the EU, which take a long time. Bilateral and simple negotiations between positive countries take often a year or most 2 years. But negotiating a continuing free trade agreement with the EU is different in kind from negotiating a free trade agreement with a third party with whom at present you have no such agreement. Negotiating a trade agreement between Canada and the EU took time because the EU has 12,500 different tariff lines. Canada has 5,500 differently defined tariff lines with different tariffs. One country says to the other, or one group says to the other, we'll reduce these tariffs over 5 years if you reduce those tariffs over 3 years, and so on. And it takes a long time. If you start with zero tariffs, and you're going to end up with zero tariffs, what is there to negotiate? Why does it take more than 10 minutes? Even Sir, what's his name? Our ambassador, pardon? Ivan Rogers, Sir Ivan Rogers, who resigned as our permanent representative in the EU the other day, and had previously, or a memo from his supposedly had been leaked saying it was thought these negotiations could take up to 10 years. When I put this to him that it would only take 10 minutes on tariffs, he agreed. It seemed to me a sort of disparity between 10 minutes and 10 years, but nevertheless. Now, on no tariff barriers, they can be much more complicated. But because, first of all, you have to negotiate to converge your standards, your arrangements, and so on, together, if you're doing a third-party agreement with a third party. But we start with identical standards, with identical arrangements. The day after Brexit, we will have the same as the day before because we'll have incorporated. So the only thing you really will have to negotiate, which is a feature in all trade agreements which do have deal with those non-tariff barriers, is the arrangements that apply if one or other side diverge. If you start with the identical arrangements on whatever it is, and subsequently one side changes their terms. And so you have to have a dispute resolution mechanism, and that might take several weeks to negotiate. But they are a normal feature of such agreements. So it is simpler than a lot of people imagine. The second option, going to most favoured nation tariffs under the WTO, is what happens if negotiations either don't take place or break down. Because that is how countries trade with each other in the absence of a free trade agreement. That is how the United States, China, Japan, and Russia, for example, trade with the EU. I mention them because they're the four most successful countries in exporting to the EU, but they do so on most favoured nation tariff terms. So it clearly is not a system that prevents trade taking place. Now, that is, as it were, the default option. Which will it be? Well, if economic considerations are uppermost in the mind of our European partners, we will negotiate the former. We will succeed in negotiating a free trade arrangement with the minimum of new non-tariff barriers and some system of coping with subsequent divergence. We'll do that because economically it's in their interests as it is in ours. Indeed, it's even more in their interests than ours because they export far more to us than we export to them. We will be the biggest single market for EU exports, bigger than the United States. The United States exports more to the EU than us, but imports less. EU arrangements have been very good at enabling EU countries to export to us, but rather less successful at us exporting them for some reason. However, so we will be their biggest single market. They have a surplus in that trade, and in many goods, it's the most profitable market, like motor cars, because we drive on the left, so they can charge very high margins on their goods in the knowledge that we can't import left-hand drive cars at the price they charge on the continent. So they charge more in our market. So it's a very important market. And that's not just on cars. So it's hugely important. But it's very important to recognize that in the EU, politics often trump economics. It certainly has done in the case of the euro. If they had been driven primarily by economic considerations, they would at least have allowed Greece and possibly some other member states to take leave of absence from the euro and get their economy right. But politics trumps economics. And it may be that they will consider it vital for the unity of the European Union not to have an agreement with us, to have a period trading on most favoured nation tariffs, which is the worst, as it were, they can inflict upon us, even though it hurts them more than us. Well, people say, well, surely if it hurts them more than us, they won't do it. I don't know. I didn't go to a proper public school, but I went to a drag art school, but I'm told that I went to drag art school, but I'm told that at public schools, that when the headmaster beats a pupil, he says, this will hurt me more than it hurts you. But it never stops them doing it because they think it's necessary to inflict pain, however painful it is to them themselves, in order to discourage others doing likewise. And they want to discourage other people from countries from leaving, and more important, their voters from voting for Eurosceptic parties which might consider that option. It's not primarily out of vindictiveness. It would be that reason. I think there's a very high probability of that outcome. I don't know what it is, but it's much higher than people assume. So we need to consider that option. If I were a businessman, I'd work on the assumption there's not going to be a trade agreement. Not for a few years. After a while, they'll calm down and there'll be one. Is that a bad thing? Well, clearly, a trade agreement is the best outcome as long as it can be reached speedily. But trading on most favoured nation terms under the World Trade Organization terms is a second best, not a worst. It is better than the status quo ante. It's better than our continuing membership of the European Union. And it's important to be clear as to why. First of all, if we do so, the average tariff that we would face if we faced the external tariff of the European Union, which is, on most favoured nation terms, is the maximum they could apply to us, would be 4% or thereabouts. We've just experienced a 15% improvement in our competitiveness thanks to the movement in the exchange rate. So most companies will be net better off out even if they face that tariff. Clearly not those that face the highest tariffs, and that's 4% is an average, not a uniform level. But clearly most of our exporters will still be significantly better off than they were on June the 22nd. Secondly, we currently pay a net contribution to the EU. There was some debate in the course of the referendum campaign as to whether it was right of the Leave campaign to have plastered across the bus, we hand over £350 million a week to the EU. I personally always used the net figure. That was the gross figure. I always used the net figure. And it turns out I was rather underestimating it. I put it at £200 million a week. We now know, because the Office of Budget Responsibility has made its forecasts, in the course of the autumn statement, of how much money we will get back, assuming that we leave, or no longer have to give, net, assuming that we leave in 2019. If you want to confirm it, look up page 159 of the Office of Budget Responsibility, chart 4.27, and there it is. We will save £13 billion a year. And if you divide 13 billion by 52, you get 250 million. So we get £250 million a week back. Now, 13 billion is 8% of the value of our exports to the EU. So we are currently paying 8% to escape 4%. Now that is worse mis-selling than PPI. It is better to get that £250 million back, and if need be, use it, or, as I'll explain in a moment, other funds to compensate our exporters, than to continue to pay 4%. Of course, if we do leave, we will, I agree with Michael, we make the offer, we'll not impose any tariffs first. The French have a saying, Monsieur les Anglais, tirez le premier, but here it will be Monsieur les Continentaux, tirez le premier. We will not impose any tariffs on them unless they do on us. But if they do, obviously we would reciprocate and impose initially the same tariffs on their goods. If we did, our exporters would bear a burden of roughly £6.5 billion a year in tariffs that those importing those goods would have to pay to continental governments. Their exporters would bear a burden of £13 billion, both because they export more and they tend to be the higher tariff goods they export to us, like cars. And so we would receive £13 billion in extra tax revenue. We could use some of that to help ease things for those companies or industries which face the highest tariffs and still have billions of pounds left over to reduce taxes or ensure that the burden of those tariffs doesn't fall on the cost of living of our people. But that's not all. We will be able unilaterally to cut the tariffs, particularly, there shouldn't be much squabble about it, on those goods we don't produce, but where we have to have high tariffs because the EU insists on putting high tariffs on them, particularly some foodstuffs and some clothing products, which bear quite heavily in ordinary people's family budgets. They're just about managing households. So at present, we are raising the cost of those goods, even though we don't produce them ourselves, forcing our households to buy higher cost, inefficiently produced food or clothing from elsewhere in the EU, rather than buying it typically from developing countries who could actually probably do with that kind of boost to their growth. I'm chairman of chairman of Trade Out of Poverty, so I believe strongly in actually giving opportunities for developing countries to trade out of poverty rather than excluding them from our market, at the same time helping our just about managing households reduce their cost of living. And, again, I won't go into it because Shanker Singham will do this with infinitely more knowledge and in greater depth than I can. We will be able to negotiate trade agreements with the rest of the world. But I will point out there is a lot of the rest of the world. The EU is less than a quarter of the world economy, so that, by simple arithmetic, leaves 75% of the world economy outside the EU, and we will be able to improve our trade terms with them. But that's not all. We will also, once out, be able, as I mentioned earlier, to reduce the burden on our industry, particularly on companies which never have traded with the EU, and by reducing the burden of regulation once we're in control of it as well. So it's not a question of a choice between the good and the bad, but between the first best and the second best. The first best is undoubtedly a continuing free trade agreement with the EU, no tariffs and no new barriers. The second best is moving to World Trade Organization's on most favored nation terms. The worst is staying where we were before June the 23rd. And it's important to get that over because there's nothing to be afraid of World Trade Organization terms. The World Trade Organization was set up to promote international trade, to forbid discrimination, to insist that if you offer a maximum tariff to, all the other countries, you have to offer it to everybody. So it's a good enough system to trade under, and particularly within it, we can then improve our trade relationships with many other countries. The best outcome would be a speedy move to a free trade agreement. The worst outcome would be a long period of uncertainty in the hope of getting a free trade agreement which fails to materialize. So I believe we should be putting all the emphasis on a speedy agreement. What about the divorce terms? Naturally, the other side have put about all sorts of figures of 60 billion, and so that we will have to pay. Slavishly accepted as a given by the BBC, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and so on. It isn't a given. I was speaking at a golf club last night, and the subject came up, and I mentioned, if you leave this golf club, you don't have to pay to leave. And today, a Lords Committee has pointed out that once you leave, the very terms of leaving are made clear in Article 50. If you leave either with an agreement or because there's no agreement, all your rights and obligations cease. And of course it's like that. Now, if it weren't, and it's like that doubly so in terms of most of what they're talking about, because the expenditure commitments into the future, the pension commitments into the future, are all commitments of the European Union institutions, not of member states. And they're always very careful to distinguish between those two things. They are not obligations of member states, and would not. But if they were, if we did have a share of the obligations of the European Union, then we would surely have a share not just of its liabilities, but its assets. And most solvent organisations, the assets exceed the liabilities. And so we'd have a share of net positive assets. Well, this is talking a bit hypothetically, because this won't happen. If they don't have net positive assets, normally you wind them up. But anyway. So I hope the government can push ahead with strength, determination and speed, and we can then get on to taking the important decisions in the areas where we've taken back control. Thank you very much.